Thank you for joining the October 2024 TAM customer webinar. This exclusive webinar series is dedicated to offering our TAM customers a unique opportunity to engage with expert speakers and explore valuable insights designed to help you maximize the benefits of your VMware by Broadcom software. Before we get into today's content, there are a couple of basic announcements. Mark your calendars for our next TAM customer webinar on November 14th. We'll be exploring the new capabilities of vSAN 8U3 as a part of VMware Cloud Foundation 5.2 with Pete Keeler. Your TAM will provide registration details for this session as it becomes available. Your interaction during this webinar is important, so please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. And if we're unable to answer your question during this webinar, please be sure to reach out to your TAM and ask them to follow up. At the end of today's session, you'll be prompted to complete a brief 2-question survey. This survey is incredibly important to us as it helps us understand the value you received from today's webinar and also helps us gather your ideas for future topics. Your feedback is greatly appreciated. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded and your TAM can make the recording link available to you. After a few months, the recording will be publicly available on the VMware TAM Services YouTube channel. That brings us to today's speaker and topic. We're pleased to have Kyle Gleed with us today. Kyle is a key member of the VMware by Broadcom VCF software division, specializing in building modern private clouds with VMware Cloud Foundation. Today, he'll provide an insightful deep dive into the various deployment topologies for VCF, along with recommendations on when to use each. Kyle, the floor is yours.
All right, Chris, thank you. Thanks everyone for taking the time. Go ahead, and as you mentioned, we will be talking about Cloud Foundation deployment today. A little bit of an introduction for myself. I've been with VMware by Broadcom for about 14 years, and I've been working with the Cloud Foundation for the past 8 years. So I have a lot of experience with Cloud Foundation. As was mentioned, put your questions in the Q&A. I see there's already a question in there, and I will cover that as we go through the presentation. And as we go through, I'll be referring to the Q&A at various times to see if there's any unanswered questions. I'll try to get to those as quick as I can. So let's go ahead and jump in. I'm going to start with a disclaimer slide. I don't know, I'm guessing that many of you probably attended VM Explore. If not, hopefully you're aware that all the sessions and particularly the keynote and everything is available publicly. You can get access to those just by doing a Google search for on-demand sessions for VM Explore. And of course, one of the big takeaways from VM Explorer was this announcement around Broadcom's vision for VCF and something that we're calling VCF 9. So I'm not going to get into a lot of details on that, but I did want to set some context here as we jump into our deep dive on deployment topologies and just kind of put some context around where this all is leading with that VCF 9. So as we go through, just keep in mind anything mentioned about future state, future capabilities, this disclaimer does apply. I don't think I'll be getting anything, but should I make a comment or anything about some future capability, just be aware that there's no guarantee of anything in terms of the future or timeline or anything like that. So let me just kind of go ahead and jump in. So of course, at Broadcom, VMware by Broadcom, our vision is to deliver the best private cloud platform possible to our customers. And a key part of this is bringing together that compute, storage, and networking stack. And we're going to be focusing a lot on this, particularly around, deploying Cloud Foundation, the role that vSAN plays, the role that NSX plays. And basically, we're taking these components and we're putting them together into this unified platform. And then not only are we're building this out so that it's easy to consume. So not only are we basically trying to integrate these solutions into a single solution product, but we're also looking at the ways that you consume these. So today, I'm guessing that many of you probably have a little bit of experience with Cloud Foundation, and you're probably aware of some of the challenges that you have around, hey, I log into the vCenter client and I get this message that say, hey, this vCenter server is being managed by the SDDC manager, so don't make any changes. And then you go to the SDDC manager, but you can't do things like rename, or you can't do things that you want to do. And you get into this kind of catch-22. And then you say, well, let me go look at the networking. Well, there's another UI. You have to log into the NSX manager, and then you log out and say, well, I wonder how I'm doing from a health perspective, and you log into operations. And so there's a lot of UIs, a lot of jumping around. And so one of the things that we're trying to do with this planned innovation, as you see, as we go forward, and you're starting to see some of this even in 5.2 and 5.2.1, was just GA'd yesterday. You're starting to see our efforts around basically integrating these solutions into a single unified platform. And then, and then making it easier for us to come in and consume it, whether that be through traditional workloads, VMs, or whether you're looking at running Kubernetes, or you're looking to get started with some AI, ML type stuff. And then, of course, we do have all the add-on services on top of that. And so when we think about this best-in-class private cloud, we think about this vision of Cloud Foundation 9, this unified platform. Of course, it all starts internally with us at Broadcom. So many of you, I'm sure, have been longtime VMware customers, and you probably speak the same language we speak, and for years we were divided into different business units. We had the vSphere division, we had the NSX division, the vSAN division, we had the cloud management, the ARIA suite, and we were very siloed in terms of how our approach to the private cloud. And one of the things that Broadcom has done in this past year since the acquisition is they basically removed that, and now we're all part of one unified division. So, in order for us to deliver this unified solution, of course, we need to be a unified team behind it. So we've taken this initial step, and this is one of the big changes we've made within the VMware by Broadcom is we're now all one division. On my team, I sit next to my peers who are specialists on NSX, peers who are specialists on ARIA operations, ARIA automation, as well as vSphere. We're all together now. We're no longer separate groups in separate business units. And that's going to allow us to deliver this unified platform, which gives you that modernized infrastructure, that cloud experience, and it's secure. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because it is available. I imagine some of you have already heard this, but if you are more interested in more, do go check out those on-demand sessions from VM Explorer. But I do this because I want to set some context, because if VMware Cloud Foundation 9 is this vision, and this is where we're headed toward, how do you get started? And the answer to that is you get started by deploying VCF 5.2 today. So if we kind of are look at the path to the future, and we say, okay, well, that path begins with VCF 5.2. So if you're running just vSphere infrastructure, or if you're running older versions of Cloud Foundation, just keep in mind that as you go forward and as you look at where we're going, and I think the vision is very exciting. I think everybody would agree that it's a good vision, and if we can deliver on it, it's a lot of good things that will come, turning that data center into a private cloud and be able to operate as a cloud model. And so I think we're all motivated to get to 5.2. And so we'll focus on that as we go through. Okay, so let's talk about VCF 5.2 real quick, just some of the features and capabilities. We did just release VCF 5.2.1. I think it just GA'd yesterday. So everything I will talk about from here on is pretty much what's shipping, what's on the truck today. We continue to innovate in each of those areas. So while we have moved away from our siloed approach in terms of having compute, storage, and network as separate units, the SDDC, the core platform, is still comprised of those core components. And so with compute, with 5.2, we've introduced some improvements around live patching with ESXi. We've done some decoupling of the Kubernetes service. You'll notice there's a lot of renaming going on, and hopefully that won't create too much confusion, but I'll try and clarify as we go through. But we've basically decoupled the Kubernetes from the vCenter version, so you're no longer tied to that. We have enhancements around GPU support. There's also some enhancements around our DPU support. On the storage side, of course, with Cloud Foundation, we now have support for vSAN ESA. So if you're not familiar, the OSA was the original storage architecture. We introduced ESA with vSphere 8, and now with Cloud Foundation 5.2, a new paradigm to vSAN. A lot of performance improvements, a lot of improvements around data protection and snapshots. So that's a good benefit. We have vSAN storage clusters, formerly known as vSAN Max, and then the data protection and the stretch cluster support as well. And then on the networking side with NSX, you're going to start to see a lot more integration with NSX, primarily around this new capability called VPCs. If you're familiar with VPC in the context of, say, Amazon Web Services or AWS. It's the same concept, just in the private cloud context, as well as we're making it very easy for customers to get started with their adoption of virtual networks. And so anyways, that's just some of kind of the innovation. We're continuing to make improvements. Got a bit of a smart marketing spin here on this slide, but I'll go ahead and jump on to the next slide. And I just want to, as we're calling out the VCF and the capabilities, I just want to remind everybody that one of the core benefits, one of the core capabilities provided by VCF and the SDDC Manager specifically is the centralized and automated patching upgrade. And there's a lot of improvements, particularly in VCF 5.2 around patching that are provided. So again, this is a core capability. So if you're asking yourself, hey, why Cloud Foundation? Why do I need to move to Cloud Foundation? I would just kind of summarize that as there's a lot of capabilities and benefits available to you, but it's also the first step on your path to the VCF 9 and the future vision that Broadcom is working to deliver. Okay, so let's get into the meat of the topic here and talk about deployment and deploying Cloud Foundation. So normally, if we were in a room, I would ask everybody to kind of raise their hands and let me know how many of you have deployed Cloud Foundation, how many of you have experience with Cloud Foundation. We're going to be talking about things like the Cloud Builder. We'll be talking about concept of workload domains and things like that. And I usually get about, maybe a third of the hands will go up. But that tells me that there's probably 2/3 of the people who are new to Cloud Foundation. And so I want to make sure we level set on some of the core concepts of Cloud Foundation, because when we get in and start talking about deployment considerations, you got to understand this concept of the workload domain. Okay. So looking at the Q&A here, let me just real quick go through the Q&A and answer a couple of the questions before we jump in. So decoupled from Tanzu in what ways? So that's a reference to the slide where I was talking about how we have decoupled the Kubernetes. So essentially, when you we have the TKG service, which is basically you take a vSphere cluster and you can enable Kubernetes on that cluster. And when you enable Kubernetes on that cluster, it becomes what we call a supervisor cluster. And when you enable Kubernetes on that cluster, the version of Kubernetes that's running on that supervised cluster is tied to the vCenter version that you're running. So if you're running vCenter, say 8.0 or 8.0 update 1 or 8.0 update 2, the version of Kubernetes is tied to that vCenter. So if you're running a version of Kubernetes on your supervisor cluster and say you want to go to a newer version, you're unable to do that because you have to wait for the vCenter release, the next vCenter release to get that update. That was very problematic for many of our customers because they were basically tied to a Kubernetes version that was tied to vCenter, and anybody who's worked with Kubernetes knows the Kubernetes releases a lot more often than what vCenter does. So what we've done with 5.2 is we basically decoupled that, and now the version of Kubernetes is no longer tied to the vCenter. So you can now upgrade your Kubernetes independent of the vCenter. That will allow you to basically bring in these newer versions of Kubernetes more quickly, and you won't be tied to the older versions and that will help you with your adoption of Kubernetes. So hopefully that helps answer that question. A question, will there be interim VCF 5, 6, 7, 8 versions before the unified 9 version? Again, as far as timelines and the future, I can't really comment on what will be coming in terms of the next version. VCF 5.2.1 is the shipping version. VCF 9 is kind of the tag we've given this future state. What will release between now and then and the timelines, I can't really comment on. So good question, but unfortunately, I really don't know the answer to that. There's a question about VCF hardware compatibility. You can Google VCF hardware compatibility. It should take you to the web page where you can get access to the hardware interoperability compatibility guide as well. So the question about using Cloud Builder to deploy the managed domain, I'm going to cover that as we get into the slides with regards to things like DNS and NTP and dependencies. So I'm going to hold off on that one. And the question here, we're looking to go to VCF, but we can't, as it has to be a vSAN environment. Can VCF be deployed without vSAN? I will cover that in the presentation as well, so hang on to that one as well. And so if you got through 3 of those, let's jump in. So um, before we can really talk about deployment topologies, we need to understand this concept of a workload domain. And so the workload domain is essentially the building block of the private cloud. One way you can think of a workload domain is every vCenter server instance is going to be a separate workload domain. So if I have 3 vCenter servers, I'm going to have 3 workload domains. Okay. And this workload domain is basically a pool of capacity that is available for me to carve out infrastructure to host workloads. So within a workload domain, I can create vSphere clusters. And of course, vSphere clusters are comprised of hosts. And as we go through, I'm going to be talking about these clusters as though they are comprised of compute, storage, and networking. So vSphere, vSAN, and NSX. But to that question earlier, just keep in mind that the vSAN is optional. We do support non-vSAN workload domains, and we'll get into that a little bit more detail. So to kind of hint to the future answer is yes, you can deploy Cloud Foundation without vSAN, and we'll talk about that. But then as you want to scale up, scale out, you can add clusters, you can add host of clusters, and we have automation provided through the SDC manager in order to basically make that very easy. Okay. And then in addition to deploying and standing up these virtual infrastructure, these workload domains, we can also go in and do patching and upgrading over time. So the workload domain is a very important concept. It's good to make sure you have a good understanding of the concept of a workload domain as you get started with Cloud Foundation. Now, of course, when you start with Cloud Foundation, you got to start with your first cluster. And that first cluster, actually, I got a little ahead of myself. So let me just kind of show an example of this. So here, that first cluster is going to be the management domain. So you always start with that first cluster, and that is our management domain. And you're going to basically look at your data center as a inventory, a pool of capacity. So you're going to have these rows of racks, and in these rows of racks, you're going to have these servers. They could be different servers, different topologies, different configurations. But you're basically going to want to go in and say, hey, I need to take some of this capacity, and I need to basically create a cluster where I can run some workloads. So you go to the SDC manager, which is represented by this little gear icon, and you'll say, hey, create me a new workload domain, and we'll take some of that capacity and create a new workload domain. And in front of that workload domain will be a vCenter server. It will be part of an NSX fabric. And depending on this type of storage, whether it be NFS, fiber channel, vSAN, it will have an associated set of storage available with it. And of course, I can create a cluster for production, a cluster for private AI, a cluster for Kubernetes. And again, it's all automated through the SDDC manager. Now, I go in and say I get some new servers. I can bring those into the Cloud Foundation inventory, and then I can use those new servers to say, make some clusters bigger or to add additional clusters to those existing workload domains. Okay. And so that's kind of the core capability of the SDDC manager and this idea of a workload domain. So you basically take your data center. It's a pool of capacity. You carve out capacity by creating these workload domains. And then on these workload domains, you run your workloads. And those workloads can be everything from traditional VMs to containers to private AI to databases to whatever services you want to run. Okay, so I mentioned how we start with the first cluster. That first cluster is called the management domain, and the management domain has a unique role. Now, in terms of its configuration, the management cluster's architecture topology is pretty much the same as any other workload domain. What makes the management domain unique is a couple of things. One, it's the first cluster you deploy, but it's also the cluster where you're going to host all your management infrastructure components. So things like the SDDC manager itself, the vCenter server, the NSX managers, the ARIA suite components, they all get deployed on the management domain. So with Cloud Foundation 5.2 and the current version, when doing a Greenfield deployment, we do require 4 vSAN ready nodes. Okay. Now, I mentioned that you can deploy Cloud Foundation without vSAN, and I will get to that later. But for now, let's just assume we're going to go ahead and use HCI nodes. And so we're going to use these vSAN ready nodes. So this is, so by default, you're going to start with the minimum of 4. And the reason for 4 is because it is vSAN. And so 3 is the minimum for a vSAN cluster. We require a 4th node for redundancy. And, you basically use something called the Cloud Builder to go in and stand this up. And then once you stand it up, it's going to have your SDDC manager, your vCenter, your NSX, and then you can optionally go in and deploy the vRealize components through the SDDC manager in what's called VCF aware mode. And those will also get deployed inside the managed domain. And then you can choose to either, if you have, depending how big your servers are, depending on the size of your environment, how much capacity you have, you can also run workloads on top of this as well. And so the managed domain, you can run workloads on it. It is the thing that makes the managed domain unique is because this is where you're going to run all your vCenter servers and your SDDC managers. So one of the things to keep in mind about the managed domain, though, is it's not static. So once I deploy Cloud Foundation, I have an initial footprint on top of those servers. Each time I add a new workload domain, there's going to be additional servers deployed on the managed domain, particularly a new vCenter server and potentially another NSX manager cluster. So just keep in mind, we start with 4 nodes, but it doesn't have to be 4 nodes. You could have 8 nodes, you could have 12 nodes, I could have multiple clusters. I can scale the managed domain up, and we'll get into some of those examples of why you'd want to do that, how you do that later. But anyways, this managed domain, hopefully you have a good understanding of the concept of the managed domain. And again, the key takeaways here is when doing a greenfield deployment, it does require a vSAN. It requires a minimum of 4 nodes. It gets created during the initial deployment, which is done by using something called the Cloud Builder. And this is where we're going to run those infrastructure components. And you can optionally run compute workloads, and you can optionally host the vRealize components in there as well. Now, once you've created your managed domain, any future domains you get created will be called a virtual infrastructure domain or just simply a workload domain. Okay, and so workload domains can be comprised as few as 3 servers when using vSAN, but you can also create workload domains with NFS storage and fiber channel storage, which can be 2 servers. So you have a little bit more flexibility here in your workload domains. But here you'll see an example where here I have a management domain already deployed, and you'll see my 4 vSAN ready nodes here. Now I want to create a second virtual infrastructure workload domain where I'm going to host additional workloads. So I add more servers to my environment, and then I create a new workload domain. In this example, I just happen to be using 4. Notice that in the manager domain, I now have another vCenter server, another NSX manager. So again, keep in mind that the manager domain is something that will grow over time as you add more capacity, and so it's not static. And then I can go in, I can run my compute workloads on there, and then I can go in and add more servers, create another workload domain. Now this new workload domain, I'm only going to add a vCenter because it can share the NSX fabric. Within the workload domains, you can have either a dedicated fabric or a shared fabric per workload domain. So here I just get another vCenter server, and then I can go in and host more workloads. And then I can go inside of NSX and I can start deploy edge clusters for north-south routing, as well as some of the edge capabilities in terms of firewalling and things like that. And but anyways, hopefully that's a good overview of the concept of a workload domain. We have a good understanding of a management domain as being that first domain and a special purpose because it's hosting the infrastructure workloads, and then the idea of the VI workload domain as a separate cluster, separate environments for hosting compute workloads. Okay, so as we go through and we look at the deployment topologies, this will all be good information to kind of help us understand the way we design and deploy Cloud Foundation. Okay, so let's get into some deployment topology. But before I do, I'm just going to take a quick look at the Q&A here and just see if there's any questions. How do I deploy the management domain without vSAN? I'm going to cover that in a little bit more detail, but in a nutshell, use a new feature called VCF import. So with VCF 5.2, we've introduced this new capability where we can import existing vSphere environments into the Cloud Foundation, and these existing vSphere environments do not need to be running vSAN. And so I'll cover that more as we go through. Can the VCF management domain be deployed with no NSX? And the answer to that is no. NSX is a required component of the private cloud, and it does get deployed as part of the private cloud deployment. With that said, that's not to say that you have to use NSX. You will have an NSX manager cluster. You will have virtual networking kind of capabilities at your fingertips, but you can choose to ignore that and just go ahead and continue to use your VLAN backed DVPGs and continue to do things the way you want. So if you're not ready for NSX, or you have some reservations about NSX, it is there, and it's available to you, but there's no requirement that you need to use it. Hopefully, you'll kind of help. You'll kind of start to see that role of software-defined networking in the cloud and the importance of it, and you'll start to realize that it is something that you'll want to have. And since you already have it, it's already installed. It'll be something that you'll begin to use. So hopefully, I can help persuade you that in that way. Brownfield environment supported in workload domains, yes. There are some limitations to the VCF import feature. We can talk about that. Is NSX deployed on the 4 nodes? Yes, NSX is deployed. We've talked about that. Does each workload domain require a separate vCenter? Yes. So the idea of a workload domain is there's a one-to-one relationship between a vCenter and a workload domain. But keep in mind, behind each vCenter server, I can have multiple vSphere clusters. So in Cloud Foundation 5.2, you can have up to 25 workload domains, so 25 vCenter server instances. But behind those vCenter servers, you can have many, many clusters up to the vSphere maximums. And years ago, I've been with VMware for 14 years, and years ago, vCenter server sprawl was a real issue for a lot of customers. There's been a lot of work done over the years to kind of help reduce the number of vCenter server instances. All the reasons for that still apply. So when you're in Cloud Foundation, we're not trying to promote or trying to return to the days of vCenter server sprawl. You do want to kind of pay attention. What are the reasons why I'd want to have separate workload domains as opposed to have separate clusters within a workload domain? Things like use case, you want to separate production from QA from test, or patching and upgrading. I want to be able to have separate versions of the software running across different environments for different reasons. So there are some use cases for that, but for the most part, the way you would architect your vSphere environment is the same way you would architect Cloud Foundation in terms of deploy your vCenter server, deploy your vSphere clusters, run your workloads on your clusters, and to scale out by adding more clusters, and then create vCenter servers, additional vCenter server instances, or additional workload domains as makes sense for you and your environment. Okay. So lots of good questions. Looks like brownfield ingestion is going to be a hot topic, and we will get to that as we go through. But in order to make sure we get there, let's go ahead and jump in. So let's talk about our deployment topologies now, since we're talking about deploying Cloud Foundation. So we've got an understanding of the workload domains, kind of the way we scale up, scale out. Now let's talk about deployment topologies. So of course, the basic and the most simplest topology is just a single site or a single region deployment, where you basically just you can start with the 4 servers. You're going to use the Cloud Builder to do a bring up. It's going to instantiate a single cluster with a single vCenter server and an SDDC manager. Okay, and that would be the smallest topology as far as a greenfield deployment goes. And even for a brownfield deployment, we do still require those 4 servers. That may have changed in 5.2.1. We'll have to check the release notes, but I'll talk a little bit more about that. But anyways, so you stand up that management domain in a single location, a single data center. And then when you have just that single cluster and you want to host workloads on top of that. So here, like if you just look at this diagram and you ignore the cluster on the left, the vCenter on the left, and just look at the right. Let's say I got a vCenter server with a 4-node workload domain. That first one, of course, that's going to be my management domain. And as I mentioned, I can host both my infrastructure, my vCenter servers, my NSX managers, my SDC manager, as well as my compute workloads on this cluster. I can make this cluster 8 nodes. I can make it 12 nodes. I can add additional clusters. But I can take that first vCenter server, that first workload domain, that management domain, and I have a lot of flexibility there. When I choose to run workloads on the same cluster along with my infrastructure workloads, that's what we call the consolidated architecture. So hence the word consolidated, because you're consolidating management infrastructure with compute workloads on the same workload domain. Okay. There are use cases for this. So depending on your topology, a lot of customers will have like remote locations where they'll want to stand up a single 4-node VCF instance, and they'll basically want to run both their compute and their infrastructure workloads together on the same cluster. But as you get into more of an enterprise type topology with the data center, typically what we find is most people will want to have that dedicated management cluster. Many people do that today as kind of a best practice. They just kind of have a cluster dedicated for those management components that just runs and hosts all the vCenter servers, all the N6 managers, all my ARIA suite components, all those infrastructure components that get hosted on that, and then they keep their workloads separate. So when you separate your compute workloads from your management, that's the standard architecture. So if you hear people talking about consolidated architecture versus standard architecture, that's the difference. Consolidated architecture is basically saying that you're going to run compute workloads on your management domain. And you can mix them. You can have a consolidated management domain together with other workload domains as well. And when you run in a consolidated architecture, keep in mind that's where we use resource pools in order to provide some isolation and some prioritization, so that if you get into a situation where your cluster gets loaded, you can make sure that the priority for CPU memory resources will go to, say, the vCenter server, the NSX manager, to make sure that those components get the capacity they need. And they don't get starved by the compute workloads. Okay. But here, this is a single site, single location. So so a lot of flexibility in terms of how you deploy it. The diagram is very simple, but you could deploy this to be very large. But the key here, takeaways when you do a single region deployment, of course, is you don't really have any resiliency or redundancy. You don't have any protection against disasters or failures outside of like VCRHA or DRS or things like that. So that takes us to the next example, where you can go in and you can basically take that single region deployment, and if you have two data centers with a high-speed interconnect, you can set up what is called a vSAN stretch cluster. This is very, very popular. We have a lot of customers doing this, but essentially what you do is you have two separate locations that are separated by some distance. They could be two separate data center halls or separate data centers in two different buildings. But this will give you some protection against some type of localized, disaster or localized event. So say, for example, you have a fire in one building, your workloads can fail over and run in the other building, or a tree falls on a building, or something like that. So it's not a wide area disaster, but we basically take this single region and we divide it into what's called availability zones. So you basically have two separate zones, separate power, separate, they're separated by some distance with a high-speed interconnect. And you can basically take the clusters and you can stretch them across that using vSAN stretch cluster. It does require the vSAN witness, and that vSAN witness does need to be in a third location outside of these two to prevent kind of a split brain type scenario. But anyways, this is a valid architecture. It's quite a common architecture. So you're basically taking a single instance and stretching them across two availability zones. Now notice that when you do this, you do have to stretch the management cluster first. So a lot of people will get into this design and architecture and they'll have questions about, okay, you got this management domain. I've got my compute domain. Now I want to stretch my compute domain, but do I have to stretch my management domain? And the answer is yes. And then they'll say, well, why do I have to do that? Well, keep in mind that management domain is where your vCenter server is going to run. It's where your NSX managers are going to run. And it's also where your NSX edge clusters would be running. And so if you had some type of outage in the primary availability zone, you would need those components to be able to run in the failover, the second availability zone as well. So you have to be able to take those components over with you in addition to the workload. So that's why you need to stretch the management cluster. So you can get into a situation here where you have like availability zone 1, availability zone 2. You've got, they call them sites. I kind of struggle with this because what I think is the disaster recovery across regions and sites, I think that's a little bit different than availability zones. But anyways, you have zone 1, zone 2. You have your management domain down here. You have your workload domain. So again, you'll need to stretch the management domain first, and then you can stretch your other workload domains. And you could have workload domains that are not stretched as well. So you don't have to stretch everything. You can pick and choose. But anyways, that's the stretch cluster topology. And again, very, very common, particularly in Europe. We find that a lot of people like this. But and the big thing here is the need to stretch the management cluster and then the requirement for that vSAN witness. And so then that gets us into the third topology here. This is the Cloud Foundation. This is our dual region deployment. So this is more of a traditional kind of BCDR type deployment where I have a data center, say in Phoenix and a data center in Dallas, and I want to use replication to replicate workloads between the two. And then if I have a disaster, say in Dallas, I come up in my second data center in Phoenix. And so for this, you can deploy this, the way it works is you would have two separate VCF instances. So notice the two separate SDC managers. So I deploy VCF in my first data center. I deploy VCF in my second data center. And then I will basically set up a vSphere replication together with VM Live Site Recovery, or what's formerly known as SRM, Site Recovery Manager, to help replicate those VMs, create those protection groups. And then I can tie that in with the NSX Global Manager in order to help provide some the NSX capabilities around my firewalling and things like that as well. So we do have support for this dual region deployment as well. And if you're familiar with our VMware validated solutions, the VMware validated solutions that we have basically have great detail on how to implement this topology. They use the ARIA suite as kind of the application workload that we're protecting. So they're kind of geared towards that, but you can basically use this topology to protect any of your workloads across dual regions. Dual region. Okay. So we've talked about three so far. We've talked about the single site, and we talked about how to single site you can deploy with a consolidated architecture or a standard architecture. The difference being where your compute workloads run. Do you run compute workloads on the management domain, or do you keep the management domain separated, run compute workloads on other domains? We talked about the stretch cluster. We talked about dual region. So let's take a minute and talk about the edge. So the edge has been an interesting use case. If you're familiar with Cloud Foundation 5.0 and 4.5 and earlier, we've really had limited support for running VCF at the edge. We basically supported basically 8 remote clusters, we called them. And we were tied to 8 remote clusters, and it didn't really scale, and it was kind of a limiting capability. So one of the things we've done in the last year, particularly with VCF 5.2, is we've introduced a new SKU, a new way to purchase VCF that provides flexibility in terms of how you can deploy VCF at these edge locations. So here is just a slide that kind of shows some examples of different types of topologies that customers have looked at. The key here to keep in mind as we go through this is flexibility. So I can go in and I can have a centrally managed remote edge. And this is basically where I have my data center. I got my SDDC manager running, and I go out and I deploy a workload domain, and the vCenter server would be running in the main data center. But the clusters that vCenter server is managing are out here at the edge locations. Okay, I could do that. There are some constraints around bandwidth and latency and number and scalability. But if I have like maybe 5 or 6 different locations, remote locations where I need to put a cluster, a 2-node or a 3-node cluster, and run some workloads, I can centrally manage that. That's one viable use case. So essentially managed remote edge. I could also basically say, you know what, I want to run everything at the edge, my management as well as my workloads. And so I might go to the edge and I might do a consolidated deployment of VCF. And when we get into this remotely managed, they can be both air gapped and non-air gapped. So I can have access to internet, or maybe I don't. But then I get over here to the far edge, and this is where you have a lot more flexibility in terms of I could just basically deploy vSphere. I don't need the SDDC manager. I can just deploy these single node clusters if I want. But the key here is with the VCF Edge and this new SKU, you can purchase VCF, and there are some requirements around the purchasing in terms of you buy them in blocks of 25. There's a certain number of cores per CPU, and there's a max number of cores. So there are some guidelines here that you'll have to be aware of and following. But basically, if you have a use case where you have a lot of edge sites and you need to deploy VCF across a large number of remote locations, you can look at this VCF Edge SKU as an opportunity to basically take those VCF entitlements that you have and basically come up with the topology, the flexibility to come up with a topology that will meet your needs and implement that without being tied to, say, any limitations imposed by the SDDC manager or anything like that. Okay. So some key takeaways here as we've talked about the different types of architectures. So single region with standard or consolidated. So hopefully you understand the difference there between standard and consolidated, but you can go and deploy in a single region. And again, consolidated, you'll use resource pools and you'll basically host compute workloads together with your infrastructure workloads. Standard, you're basically going to separate your compute workloads onto separate workload domains. And again, keep in mind, each workload domain has its own vCenter server, is managed by its own vCenter server. We have when you get, I didn't get into this, but when you do deploy with a standard topology where you have multiple vCenter servers, you have a choice between having a dedicated NSX fabric. Well, actually, no, you have it. So with the managed domain, you're always going to have a dedicated NSX fabric. Sorry, so you'll always have of NSX fabric. You know, there were some questions about that. So NSX is required when you deploy the managed domain. NSX gets installed. Now, whether or not you use NSX is a separate topic, but the binaries are there, the software is installed, the NSX manager cluster is initialized, it's ready to go. And you'll always have a dedicated fabric for your managed domain. And then you'll also have a dedicated fabric for your first virtual infrastructure workload domain. For any subsequent virtual infrastructure domains, you can either have a dedicated or a shared NSX fabric. So as you go forward, you can choose whether or not you want to have a dedicated NSX fabric for, say, this workload domain and this workload domain, or maybe you want to share them. And if you share them, that's where the new capabilities around NSX and the VPCs will come in, because they help provide multi-tenancy and a way to isolate and share. And the big thing here is as you deploy NSX, each new NSX fabric is going to require 3 NSX manager nodes. So if I'm going to have 5 or 6 workload domains, that's 15, 18 VMs they're running. I can consolidate that down to 3 VMs to have a shared NSX fabric, and then use VPCs to kind of help manage that scalability. So you can do site resiliency with vSAN stretch clusters. You can do VCDR with dual region NSX federation. And then we have this new edge SKU to provide flexibility for deploying VCF at the edge. Okay, so I'm going to get into a little bit on networking, but let's go back to the questions here and just kind of see where we're at. Starting to see a lot of them come in. So let me just take a couple of these and then we'll get in, and then I'll try and save some time at the very end to go through more thoroughly. Can you configure a stretch cluster if the storage is fiber channel rather than vSAN? So for me, the lexicon that I use is when I'm talking about a vSAN stretch cluster that's based on vSAN. If you want to use, say, a storage array or some other vendor's kind of equivalent, that would be what I would term a metro cluster. And the answer is it depends on your storage vendor. If your storage vendor wants to support it, then yes, you can do it. But from a Broadcom standpoint, we would basically defer to you and your storage vendor. But the concepts are the same. So in theory, yes, you could implement that. But if for details on how to implement it and support and stuff, that would all be between you and your storage vendor. For that standpoint. So hopefully that answers that question. Dedicated NSX fabric, just VCF NSX networking, not Defend Firewall. Okay, so vDefend Firewall is a add-on. So that's one of the changes we've had here recently is with 5.2 and beyond, there is an extra cost for the vDefend Firewall. It's a licensing thing. You just enable it. There's no difference in the NSX installation. There's no difference in the binaries. It's just whether or not you have a license key to turn the firewalling on. But yes, it is a separate. So when we talk about NSX and out of the box, it's virtual networking, logical switching, and the security is an extra cost. So that is a good point. What is the max capacity CPU memory that can be deployed for a single edge? I can't really answer that. It's just going to depend on the SKU has some guidelines in terms of max. I think it's a max of 256 cores with a minimum of 8 cores and blocks of 25. But don't quote me on that. Reach out to your TAM and help get some get the correct numbers in terms of where you're at there. In a stretch cluster, can workloads deployed in either availability zone? Yes, that's the whole idea of a stretch cluster. Is from a workload standpoint, it's not aware of the fact. It's just it's deployed, it's running on vSAN, and it's just running behind the scenes. The fact that it's actually being mirrored across 2 different availability zones is kind of transparent to the workloads. But yes, there's an active topology where I can go into, say, availability zone 1, deploy a VM. I can go to availability zone 2 and deploy a VM, and that would work just fine. Okay, can you convert an existing VxRail environment into a VCF consolidated environment? So I haven't talked about VxRail, but just one quick note about VxRail. So VxRail is a managed service, and you'll have to talk to Dell to understand what they support in terms of consolidated architecture versus standard architecture. I know for a while they did not support a consolidated architecture, Their standpoint was, since it's a managed service and they're going to manage it, they didn't want to have compute workloads on the managed domain. And so I don't know, I do believe they did add support for consolidated, but in terms of if you have an existing VxRail deployment and you want to change something up, you'll have to talk to Dell. I can't really comment on the VxRail with that regard. And yes, there's a max latency for vSAN stretch clusters. Looks like somebody provided the link there for you. Okay, so getting a lot of questions. Let me go ahead and continue on with the presentation. And then here in about 15, 20 minutes, hopefully I'll get through my slides and then we can just kind of go through the Q&A in a little bit more of a logical progression. So let's talk a little bit about networking. So we've talked about the workload domains, we talked about different topologies. So one of the big questions that usually comes when I'm presenting on Cloud Foundation is, okay, what are the networking requirements? How do I have to set up my networking? So let's talk about that. So remember, we start with the managed domain. We're going to have, we're going to deploy a vCenter server. We're going to have an SDC manager and SX manager, and we're going to, on that environment, we're going to have a cluster. This example, 4 hosts. We're going to configure a VDS, and on that VDS, we're going to configure 4 port groups. Okay, so that's 4 VLANs that you're going to need. There's going to be a VLAN for our vSAN, assuming you're using vSAN, a VLAN for vMotion, a VLAN for our management, and then also a VLAN for the VMs that run on the management. Okay, so that's 4 VLANs, but then we are running NSX, and NSX has this concept of a TEP. So we're going to need to also have a VLAN for our TEPs. So each NIC on the host that's configured part of the VDS will have a TEP. TEP is a tunnel endpoint, and so basically that's just a NIC. That's a NIC on the SXI host that's part of that VDS, where we're going to do the network encapsulation and decapsulation as part of our NSX virtual networking. Okay, and so then we create this thing. So in terms of what do I need to get started? So from a workload domain standpoint, you're going to need to have at least 5 VLANs out of the box, a host TEP, and together with the 4 VLANs for the vSAN, vMotion, and our management. Now, yeah, so when you go into Cloud Builder, and I probably should have added that slide, but I don't have it. But in the Cloud Builder, when you go to the networking screen, there's an Excel spreadsheet that you can fill out with all the parameters that the Cloud Builder will use to do what we call bring up or to deploy Cloud Foundation. And in there, it's going to ask you for these networks. So that's usually where the question comes up, because people look at that and say, oh, well, what do I need from a networking standpoint? So to deploy it, you need these 5 VLANs, and these are the networks that they're used for. And then what we'll do is inside those, when you start using the NSX, that TEP network usually is one, there's a question about, well, what exactly is the TEP network? What does it do? That's our virtual networking. So that's how we can go in and create these virtual networks inside of our cluster using the TEP with that transport zone. And so the NSX discussion is a separate discussion, but keep in mind that's the topology by default for the managed domain, and the workload domain is the same. So remember, we have the SDC manager, and the SDC manager provides automation to stand up these workload domains. And it's a prescriptive topology in the sense that each workload domain is going to get deployed the same. So a VI workload domain would be the same. The difference being is you don't need the management VLAN, because those management workloads aren't going to run inside your VI domain. So you just have a VLAN for your VMs, your vMotion, your vSAN, and your TEPs. So when you get into a stretch cluster, the networking is key to that. I made stretch cluster sound really simple, but just keep in mind that when you get in and you just do deploy a stretch cluster, across those 2 availability zones, you will need to stretch some of these networks. I didn't talk about the edge overlay. This slide, I probably should add it. But in addition to the host TEP, there's another TEP network for the edge cluster, NSX edge cluster. So there's technically 6 VLANs. I said 5, but there's technically 6, assuming that you're going to want to run those edge clusters as well. And this is just kind of showing that when you get into the stretch cluster topology, you do need to stretch those networks. Now, keep in mind the vMotion, the vSAN, and the host overlay. You can have some local networks, and some networks will be stretched across availability zones. So if you're looking at a stretch cluster, just keep in mind that you'll want to engage with the networking team and make sure that those networks are available to you. Okay, when you deploy Cloud Foundation, you have 3 profiles out of the box that you can choose from. And these profiles are dictating your VDS configuration in terms of this is how we can do traffic separation. So we used to just put everything on 2 NICs and say use 25 or 40 gigabit NICs and call it good. But then customers came back and said, no, I need to separate my vSAN traffic from my management traffic, or I need to separate my NSX traffic from my vSAN traffic. But they just have requirements. They need to separate traffic on separate NICs for various reasons. So what we've done is we've introduced these profiles, and you'll see if you go in to there, you have choice between 3 profiles. This is just a quick summary. One profile, profile 1 is just two NICs where everything's gonna be on those 2 NICs. Profile 2 is you're gonna have, so 1 VDS and with 2 NICs and everything goes on that. This one you have 2 VDSs and you have 4 NICs. So up here you can have 1 VDS with either 2 or 4 NICs. Everything goes on that VDS. Here you have 2 VDSs with 4 NICs, and you're going to put 2 NICs. They're going to be used for your manager traffic, your vMotion, your overlay, but you're going to separate the vSAN traffic out onto the second NIC, second VDS. And here is the same thing as profile 2, but the difference being is you're going to separate the NSX overlay traffic onto that separate NIC. So, so you do have that flexibility in terms of how you set up your distributed switches and how you do your traffic separation. And again, this is all part of the Cloud Builder and the Bring Up and that Excel spreadsheet. Okay. So as far as the key takeaways, so 5 VLANs required for Bring Up, 6 VLANs when you do the edge cluster. So this is actually talking about 3 for the edge. The edge cluster requires the TEPs as well as 2 uplinks. So I guess 3. So I guess 8 VLANs total. I said 6. I forgot about the 2 uplinks. But anyways, you have your VLANs for bring up, management, the VM on management, vSAN, vMotion host overlay. And then when you deploy those edge clusters, and again, the edge clusters are optional. When you start to use NSX and get into using those NSX services, you'll need to have 3 additional VLANs for uplink 1, uplink 2, and the edge overlay. And the edge overlay and the host overlay will need to be routable. By default, we assume 2 NICs with a single VDS, but again, you customize that, and there's those 3 profiles where you can break out, say, vSAN traffic onto a separate set of NICs, or the NSX traffic, the overlay traffic. And again, those might need to be routable. Okay. Storage. So storage is pretty simple. I think I only have 1 slide here, but we talked a lot about storage. There's been a lot of questions about it. So I'm going to start off with just kind of the assumption that we're doing a Greenfield deployment. And remember, when you're doing a Greenfield deployment with the Cloud Builder, vSAN is required. Okay, so the vSAN is required, and that means you need a minimum of 4 hosts. Okay, and that we have this concept of principal and supplemental storage. So principal storage is the storage, the primary storage for the domain, and supplemental storage is additional storage that's been added or mounted into the cluster. So every cluster is going to be created with principal storage. And by default, the manager domain is going to use vSAN. And when we get into principal storage options for workload domains, so this is the manager domain down here, how the workload domains, you'll notice the workload domains, we have a lot more flexibility because we can use vSAN, or we can use vVols, or we can use NFS, or we can use fiber channel. You'll notice iSCSI is not on the list. So that's a roadmap item, but this is what we support today as far as principal storage. So when I go into the SDDC manager and I say, hey, I want to create a new workload domain, the first or second screen I get is what kind of storage are you going to use, and it's going to list vSAN, HCI mesh, or what's now vSAN storage clusters, vVols, NFS, or fiber channel. I need to pick from one of those. When I do bring up, again, the only option is vSAN, and this is for a Greenfield deployment. Now, in addition to this principal storage, there's supplemental storage where you can basically use any supported storage and add to a workload domain. So for example, I create a workload domain with vSAN. And then I have, like, say, a big iSCSI repository where I store ISOs or I store static files. I can just basically mount that up on my cluster and use that as supplemental storage. So, but the key takeaway here, the management domain, when doing a Greenfield deployment, does require vSAN. Workload domains, so the second and subsequent workload domain can be any choice of either vSAN, vVols, NFS, or fiber channel. And then you can always add supplemental storage to any workload domain, both management and VI. Okay, so vSAN is required for the managed domain and for all clusters in the management domain, I might add. So if you go in and do bring up with the cluster, and then you want to create a second cluster, that will have to be vSAN as well. And again, that's for a greenfield deployment. And we're going to talk about brownfield, and we're going to talk about VCF import here next. Okay, those are the supported storage types: vSAN, vVol, NFS, Fiber Channel, and supplemental storage can be added to any cluster. Okay, be aware that the SDC manager is not aware of your supplemental storage. So like, for example, if you go in and you add a new host to a cluster, it will not automatically mount the supplemental storage. You'd have to follow that up by going in and manually adding that. Okay, so as far as deployment goes, let's talk about this real quick. So this is a greenfield deployment. So we have this concept of, of course, vSAN is required. We've got top rack switches, ready nodes. We have this cloud builder, and I've made references to that input parameters checklist, that Excel spreadsheet. That's what this represents. We have this cloud builder. The cloud builder is an OVA. You'll download the OVA, you'll deploy it someplace in your environment where you have network connectivity to the rack. It could be VMware Workstation or Fusion running on your laptop. It could be on an ESXi host. It's just an OVA. You just need to deploy that OVA. You'll basically take this deployment checklist, you'll go through and you'll fill out all the information about your site, what names you want to use, what IPs you want to use, what VLANs you want to use, what's your DNS, what's your NTP, all that is in the deployment checklist. And then when you want to deploy Cloud Foundation, essentially you go to the cloud builder. It's got a graphical user interface. You just connect to it using a web browser. And you're basically going to, and again, you need to have that network connectivity, but basically what you're going to do is you're going to take that completed deployment checklist, that's going to be your input, and you're going to import that into the cloud builder, and then the cloud builder will go out and connect to those 4 vSAN ready nodes and basically go through the process of deploying the vCenter server, configuring the 4-node cluster, configuring the vSAN data store, setting up the VDS, deploying NSX, and basically standing up that management domain. So that is how you do a greenfield deployment. And again, that's based on the VMware Cloud Builder. So, so the managed domain gets deployed by the Cloud Builder for a greenfield deployment. Minimum of 4 hosts. Those 4 hosts do have to be vSAN. And this is where we're going to host our SDC infrastructure. And I kind of hinted at this earlier, but just kind of want to reiterate, plan for growth. Just keep in mind that when you're sizing out those servers for the manager domain, just remember that the manager domain is not static. As you add more workload domains, as you add the ARIA suite, as you add additional components, you can expect that to get larger. Now, whether it gets larger by making the 4-node cluster an 8-node cluster, or it gets larger by adding additional 4-node clusters is up to you. There's some flexibility, but you want to plan for growth. So in other words, when you're looking to purchase, don't go cheap on your management vSAN ready nodes, because you will need that additional capacity as you grow. Okay, so with that, I want to kind of slow down here. I've been talking quite a bit. So we've talked about deployment topologies. We've talked about how to do greenfield deployment. And many of you may be sitting back right now and thinking to yourself, yeah, but what? I have existing vSphere infrastructure. I got existing, my data center is full of vSphere environments. I have existing infrastructure. I have an existing storage investment. I just put lots of money into my new fiber channel array or my new NAS array, and I really don't want to start over by doing a greenfield deployment. Okay, all valid questions and very fair questions. And this is something we've struggled with over the years. As I've been with Cloud Foundation for 8 years, and one of the challenges we've always had is how do we go into those existing data centers where you're already running your existing vSphere environments on existing storage, and you want to adopt Cloud Foundation, but you don't want to have to start by doing a greenfield deployment and then figuring out how to migrate workloads into this new environment. I just basically want to take my existing environment and convert it into a Cloud Foundation private cloud. And that is where the VCF import tool comes. And so with the VCF import tool introduced in Cloud Foundation 5.2, we can now convert or import existing vSphere infrastructure into a VCF private cloud. So to all those questions about, hey, how can I deploy a managed domain without vSAN? How can I stand this up on my existing infrastructure without having to migrate workloads? This is the answer. Now, as was alluded to in the questions, there are some limitations. 5.2 is the first kind of a 1.0 release of VCF import. And as we go forward, we'll be making improvements to it. And I'll talk to some of those as we go through. So what exactly is VCF import? So with VCF import today, it has 3 capabilities. We can convert an existing vSphere environment into a management domain. And remember the significance of the management domain. and we can import existing vSphere infrastructure into a virtual infrastructure local domain. And then we also have this feature called sync, which allows us to basically sync changes made in the vSphere client with the SDDC manager. So today it's a command line tool. So it is a separate download. If you go out to the Broadcom software portal and you do a download, you'll see it listed as it's Brownfield import is the unfortunate name they gave it, but the marketing name is VCF import. But you'll see that as an available download. It's a tar file. You download that tar file, you SCP it to the SDDC manager, you extract it on the SDDC manager, and as a user VCF, through an SSH session, you run the CLI tool. Today, we can import vSphere environments as well as vSphere with vSAN environments. We cannot yet import environments that have NSX configured. So if you already have NSX configured environment, you won't be able to use the import yet. That's a roadmap item. If you have vSphere environments, say running on NFS or running on Fiber Channel, great. If you have a vSphere environment running on HCI with vSAN, great. We can import those. So it's kind of a crawl, walk, run approach where we're starting with what we think the majority of our customers have, vSphere and vSphere with vSAN, and allowing them to bring those in and create a cloud foundation private cloud. And then as we go forward, we'll start to account for things like, say you have a stretch cluster, or say you have NSX deployed, or you have some of the more advanced configurations. Those will come over time. Okay. So the benefit of this VCF import tool is we're going to let you start where you are. So implement existing cloud on existing infrastructure. So there's no requirement for vSAN. There's no requirement that you start over by going out and getting 4 new hosts and standing up a new cluster. Now, I'm not to say that you don't. There's not. As we talk about this, I just want to kind of caution you to. There are benefits of doing a greenfield deployment. And I would say greenfield deployment is probably the preferred method for deploying Cloud Foundation. Now, why do I say that? Well, because if you think of your existing vSphere environments, many of them are probably old. When I say old, maybe like a year to 18 months to 24 months. If I have 5 or 6 of them, there's going to be different configurations. They might be running different versions, and there's just as with anything, there's just kind of a lot of things that accumulate over time. And so if given the option to take those existing environments and bring them into my private cloud with all the baggage that comes with them, all the configuration and every configuration being different and stuff, or starting fresh with a brand new install, it might be wise if I'm in a situation where I'm doing a hardware refresh, to maybe start with a greenfield deployment, particularly for the managed domain, and then import the other clusters as VI workload domains, for example. So the point here being is there's not a right or wrong answer, and I'm not trying to say one versus the other. Obviously, we're introducing this capability, but don't just dismiss the greenfield and walk away from this presentation thinking, oh, I no longer have to use the cloud builder, I no longer have to do a greenfield deployment, because that may very well be the best viable option for you. So don't dismiss it, but view this as additional options. And so for many, it will be a great option and it will be something we'll use. But for others, maybe this won't be the approach you go. So it's not a replacement for greenfield deployment. It's just another option. Okay. So it's simple. It's non-disruptive. I do have a demo I can show here as we go through. I'm going to try and get through this next couple slides and then take some questions. And then if we have time, we can jump into the demo. There's the convert use case. So again, when you use convert, this is when you're in a data center where there's no SDDC manager. If you have an existing SDDC manager, you don't do the convert. You'd go to that SDDC manager, upgrade it to 5.2, and then you can do the import because you already have an SDDC manager. The convert is when you do not have an SDDC manager and you need to instantiate a management domain. So for this, you're going to go out, you're going to deploy the SDDC manager and seed the import scripts. So you're basically going to download the SDDC manager and the import scripts, which is that tarball. Deploy the SDDC manager. It's just an OVA. You're going to SCP the tarball, extract it, and then log into the SDDC manager and run the convert. And this is what that command line looks like. It is a command line tool. We are looking to make it a UI, something built into the UI. But for VCF 5.2 and 5.2.1, it is a command line tool. And you basically just run this VCF Brownfield PY. It's a Python script. Pass in the vCenter name with your SSO and the name of the domain you want to create, and pass in the NSX deployment spec, and it will basically instantiate the management domain. Okay. Now we can compare that to the import where you already have the management domain and now you're importing a VI domain. So here, since you already have the SDC manager, you just need to have the scripts and you basically pull those environments in. Here's the example of that script, that command line. Okay. Now there was a third functionality I talked about, and this is the sync. Now keep in mind with the sync, this is where, we have kind of a two-headed snake here in the sense that you have the vSphere client, you have the SDC manager. I mentioned when I started off how you can log into the vSphere client. It'll give you this banner saying, hey, this is managed by the SDC manager, don't make changes. And that can create some challenges because we have homegrown automation, we use the vSphere client a lot, we're in making changes, and we constantly at risk of getting into the situation where we create config drift between our vSphere client and our SDC manager. We don't want that. We want to keep them in sync. So with this tool, we can basically use that command line tool to basically sync the domain and basically say, hey, I've made changes in my vSphere client, update my SDDC manager with those changes. And you can use the sync with Greenfield workload domains as well as imported workload domains. So this is not something that's just specific to those workload domains you've imported. You can use this on those workload domains you created from the SDDC manager as well. Okay, so that gets into the end of the slide. So we're at the top of the hour. Let me take about 10 minutes and go through some of the questions, and then we can jump in. I'll do a quick demo showing you the VCF import, as that seems to be something that a lot of people are very interested in. So let me kind of go through this. I'll try and take the questions I can get to quickly, and then anything else we can just follow up with through your TAMs if you need. Can you have a VDS that spans multiple clusters when using VCF? No, today, no. The topology within Cloud Foundation is that every vCenter server, every vSphere cluster gets their own VDS. And so having a VDS that spans clusters is not something that's currently supported in our topology. When doing the VCF import, this is actually one of the checks or one of the guardrails they look for. And if you have a VDS that's shared across clusters, it will prevent you from doing that. So just keep that in mind. VCF import requires vSAN. Let me see. Or will iSCSI work internally? Okay, so VCF import can support vSAN, NFS, or VMFS on Fiber Channel. iSCSI is not yet supported as principal storage in Cloud Foundation, either through Greenfield deployment with the SDC manager or as an import. So iSCSI is not yet supported. That's a roadmap. And VCF import does not require vSAN. That's one of the big changes there with the VCF import. I know it gets confusing because we talk about vSAN, we talk about a Greenfield deployment, talk about Cloud Builder. I'm talking about how vSAN is required, and then I turn around and talk about import, and suddenly vSAN is not required. So that is a pretty significant change, but just keep in mind that iSCSI is not yet in the list of supported topologies. So I would be interested in how Dell PowerFlex using the SDDC. Let me see. I would be interested in how Dell PowerFlex using SDDC agents plays in a storage. I'm not familiar with Dell PowerFlex or the SDDC agents, so unfortunately, I'm not able to answer that question. Can I deploy a new vCenter and NSX in my SDDC and import on clusters from a standalone vCenter using the VCF import? Yes, but keep in mind the VCF import is done at the vCenter level. So if I have a vCenter server and I have 3 clusters behind that, I import the vCenter server and all 3 clusters go with it. I cannot go in and say import just cluster 1 or just cluster 1 and 2. It's at the vCenter level. So yes, you can deploy a vCenter server. You would not deploy NSX ahead of time. What you would do is you do the import, and the import would deploy NSX as part of the import, and it would bring the vCenter server over, instantiate the NSX manager cluster, and then you'd have in your SDC manager the workload domain with all 3 clusters in that workload domain. I am interested to see how the VCF import tool can help separate into a management domain and a workload domain. I'm not really sure I understand here because the VCF import tool does not help you separate a management domain. If if I understand correctly, it sounds like you may have a managed domain where you have some compute workloads running on that managed domain in a consolidated architecture, and you're interested in how you can maybe break those workloads out into a standard architecture where you have a separate workload domain for your compute workloads and a separate workload domain for your managed workloads. The VCF import tool would not be a tool to help you do that. If you are in that situation and you want to do that, that's where HCX would come in. You could use things like cross vCenter or vMotion. You can use ACX. Those are tools that help you to basically migrate workloads between different workload domains. So we could deploy Greenfield with vSAN and then add Fiber Channel and move our VMs and manage a domain to the Fiber Channel disks. So yes, you could deploy a Greenfield with vSAN. That's an option. And then you could basically provision Fiber Channel LUNs to your host, and then you can use storage vMotion to move the VMs off the vSAN into the Fiber Channel disk. But keep in mind, you could also deploy a workload domain, a Greenfield workload domain directly to Fiber Channel. So skip the vSAN and just go directly to Fiber Channel. Fiber Channel is supported as a principal storage type for workload domains. Now, if you're talking specifically about the management domain, yes, the management domain, you would have to go through this topology. But yes, that would be something you could do. That would be a viable solution. What's the performance difference between vSAN, ESA, OSA, and ACI mesh? So I'm not a vSAN expert. I know that with the ESA architecture, they have, there's a lot of improvements, both in terms of scale and performance, as well as improvements around data protection and snapshotting. I'm not really the expert here. At the beginning of this presentation, we had the slide, and they mentioned that next month you have Pete Keeler, who's going to come on and talk about vSAN. He is the guy for that question. He would be able to talk to that. So I'll kind of just agree with you that yes, there are some good improvements, but in terms of details around that and comparing vSAN with the ACI mesh and those things, that's a question for Pete for the next month. So hopefully you'll be able to attend that one and get those questions answered there. Wouldn't you want vSAN traffic to be isolated from its own distributed switch? So good question. That seems to be kind of one of those kind of battles that some people say yes, some people say no. It depends if you have 40 gig or 20 gig or 10 gig. There's lots of things that go into that. But the point that I would make is that you can do it if you want to. The flexibility is there. So yes, that's the 3 profiles. And so we will support you whichever approach you want to take that is supported. And there are a lot of people who do want to separate the vSAN traffic on its own separate distributed switch. And so that's why we've added that capability. Can we use standard switches? No. So standard switches are not supported in Cloud Foundation. If you're going to do an import, one of the checks again is that you don't have any standard switches in your configuration. When you do a deployment from the SDC manager, again, everything's based on VDS. So standard switches are not used with Cloud Foundation. So you'll need to create a VDS and migrate to VDS for that. So question about the far edge deployment. Centrally managed far edge deployment means we have different VCF instances for managed edge sites. So the far edge deployment is more of where you're going to deploy just vSphere at these environments and not really have any centralized management. If you want the centralized management, then you can get into the other deployments where you have the SDC manager either running at a remote location or running at the edge location. So I'm not sure I really did a good job answering that, but just keep in mind the key here with the edge deployments is flexibility. So whatever it is you're thinking you want to do, chances are we could probably support you, and we have the edge SKU to help make that a little bit more affordable for you. Okay, so let's see. Go up to some of these ones at the top here just to see if I can get So question about the TKG service and has its impact on the CSI driver. So CSI is the container storage interface, and I'm not aware of any relationship between the independent TKG service and its impact on the CSI driver. So of course, when you enable Kubernetes, there's always a CSI driver. As we've gone through vSphere 7 to vSphere 8, we've made improvements to the CSI driver to enable things like multi-reader, multi-writer, things like that. But I'm not aware of how this decoupling has any impact on that. So Which release will consolidate identity management across VCF components? I can't really talk about releases or timelines. I honestly don't know the answer to that, but just keep in mind that that is something that we are looking at. That's something, if you go back and look at the keynotes from VM Explorer, Paul Turner, our lead, VCF lead for product management, he talked specifically about the need for consistent password policy, consistent identity management across the stack within the SDDC. So it is something that the product management is very keen. It's something they are working toward. In terms of timeline and when that will come out, I can't really comment, but yes, that is something it's being looked at and being worked on. Does SDDC provision VCSSH, the vCenter servers and HA clusters? No. So within Cloud Foundation, vCenter is protected by vSphere HA. We don't do a vCenter HA in terms of like deploy mirrored instances of vCenter. That's not part of the topology. So can manage a domain have a 3-node vSAN cluster? So in 5.2, 4 nodes are required for Greenfield. So in both 5.2 and 5.2.1, 4 nodes are required for Greenfield. In 5.2.1 with the VCF, 5.2 with the VCF import, 4 nodes are required for the management. But in 5.2.1, they have lowered that to 3 nodes. So with 5.2.1, you can import a management domain with 3 nodes. So that's a change in 5.2.1. So read the release notes on that. But yes, that is, I would still recommend 4. I would definitely caution. One of the biggest challenges I see is customers who undersize their management domain. And then 6 to 12 months down the road, I'm on the phone with them. I'm on the phone with them in support. And we're talking about how they're struggling because they undersized, because they went with 3 nodes instead of 4 nodes. And they had to put a node in maintenance mode. And suddenly they lost a third of their capacity. And now they were struggling. So just keep that in mind. For test and for lab environments, great. But if you're in an enterprise and you're running this production, be careful not to go too small. Let's see, 1 or 2 more, then we'll jump into the demo. So there's questions about the import tool and limitations. So let me just take that for a minute and I'll talk about that. So some of the limitations with the import tool, we've already talked about how you can't have shared VDSs across clusters. You can't have NSX already installed. We can't do vSAN stretch clusters yet. So there are a number of limitations. If you go out to the VCF blog, I wrote a blog, the introduction to the VCF import tool. And in that blog, you'll see that there, I talked to some of these limitations. So if I jump out here real quick and I just go ahead and see if I can just find this real quick. Yeah, right here. If you go out here to this blog, and our blog site is a little slow, but if you scroll down here, this is a blog, but you'll notice down here, notable limitations with these, and so you'll see them here. So go ahead, give this blog a quick read. And if you have any follow-ups, reach out to your TAM, have them reach out to me and we can talk about it. But there are some notable limitations. Hopefully that will help you. Okay, and so with that, we've got about 15 minutes left. So let me go ahead and jump into a quick demo of the VCF import tool, as there definitely seems to be a lot of interest on this. Let me take 10 minutes, go through the demo, and then we can kind of wrap it up. And for any questions that we didn't get to, again, as was mentioned, feel free to reach out to your TAM, and they can reach out to me, and we can try and help you get answers to those. But for here, these are recorded demos, the pre-recorded, so they're kind of click-through demos, but I'm just going to step through the process. So here what you'll see is I have a vSphere environment, a vSphere cluster. I actually have 2 of them. I got one environment up here, a second here, so 2 workload domains, essentially 2 vCenter servers. And I'm going to start, all I have is 2 vCenter servers. I don't have an SDDC manager, so I'm going to start by converting this cluster, cluster 1, into a VCF management domain. Okay, so for this, I do need to be running vSphere 8.0 update 3. So I do have to be running the version of vSphere that's associated with VCF 5.2. Okay, so I'm going to go up here. I got 2 clusters in this environment. That was intentional because I wanted to show how all the clusters come over. But the first thing I need to do is I need to deploy the SDDC manager. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to deploy OVF template. we come down here, and this is just deploying an OVF template. You guys have done this many times, so nothing new here. But what is new is the fact that we are now distributing the SDC Manager as an OVA. You know, previously you could only get the SDC Manager as part of the Cloud Builder OVA. Now you'll see it's a separate point. And you see up here above is that brownfield import tarball that we'll use, and then my NSX deployment JSON, and then the NSX bundle. So those are the files you'll need. I'll go ahead and I'll just deploy this real quick. I'm not going to go through the details of the OVA deployment just for the sake of time. But as you can see, it's just a pretty standard OVA deployment. Just need to kind of click through here. I am using vSAN. All my lab environments are all based on vSAN. Specify the network. And here you'll see you're going to provide a number of passwords: root password, user password, authentication password, local end user password, backup password. The one thing I will comment here is make sure you remember these passwords and you kind of keep them at a place where you can recall them, because as you do the import, you'll be asked to provide these passwords. Your standard host name, IP address, DNS, NTP settings. Okay. And so I go ahead and deploy it, and you see it's going to deploy. I just called this SDDC, and then we'll go in here and we'll just power this guy on. And now you'll notice when I power him on and I connect to it, I'm not going to be able to connect because it's waiting to be configured. You haven't configured it. It's just the SDC Manager appliance. It hasn't been configured. Okay, so that's to be expected. This will eventually time out. So the next thing I need to do now that I have the SDDC Manager deployed is I need to basically download that that VCF brownfield, that tarball, and I need to SCP that up to the SDDC Manager. So here I'm just going to use WinSCP to copy that up to the SDDC Manager. And then the way I access this again is using SSH. It's a command line tool, so I just SSH to my SDC Manager, log in as a user VCF, and here I can see that tarball. So I'm just going to go ahead and extract that tarball onto the SDC Manager. And then you'll see if I go into that VCF brownfield toolset, it's a Python script, and the files I need are inside of there. Okay. So now the next thing I want to do is I want to basically convert this vCenter instance into my management domain. So to do that, these are the scripts, the Python scripts. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this Python script, this VCF brownfield PY, but you'll notice I'm using a check option. So the check option basically says, let's go look at the vCenter environment and let's look at all the guardrails and let's see if this environment is eligible to be converted into a management domain. So this will run about a minute. And you'll see it does, in this example, it did 174 checks. And the thing you want to pay attention to is the failed checks. And you see I had 0, so I'm good. I'm ready to import. Notice here that it does give me a list of all the checks that it's looking at. So if you're curious about, hey, of these 174 checks, what are you looking at? You can look at this file and it will basically go through and show you everything that it checked, you know, host connectivity, IP addresses, all those requirements, check for some of those limitations we talked about, no shared DVSs across clusters, no standard switches, no single host. And so you can go through and look at that. Okay. And so with the check complete, you're ready to do the convert. So if the convert is the same exact command line, you just change the word check to convert, and then you run it. Okay. And because you're doing a convert, it's going to make changes. So it's going to ask you to make sure that you want to do that. Now you'll notice over here in the menu on the left, it is non-disruptive. It does make one change, but for the most part, it's completely transparent to the workloads running on this instance of the vCenter server instance. And you'll see what it does is it creates this resource pool, and it's going to move the vCenter server and the SDC Manager into that resource pool. It took a little bit over about 20 minutes for this to complete, if you do the math on that. But now I have converted it, so I come back here and you'll see that I now have management. So again, it didn't affect any of the running workloads. All it did is create a resource pool, moved the SDC Manager and vCenter into that resource pool. And so now my SDC Manager is up and running. So if I come up here and I refresh, I now have an SDDC Manager. So I now have a management domain with the SDDC Manager. And this is just like I had done a Greenfield deployment, although I did not. I imported this. And so I can come in here and I can look at my management domain. And if you're familiar, this will be, you're familiar with VCF, this will look very familiar. If you're not, I just kind of give you a quick overview. Summary of the management domain services here. I did not deploy NSX in this example. This was recorded using some pre-GA code and I didn't have the NSX pieces available at the time, but normally you'd have NSX installed as well. And then you come in here and you can see that I have all 8 hosts, the 2 clusters are showing up. And I can also manage the certificates. I can go into password management. Note that I don't have the root passwords for my ESXi host, but I do have the passwords for the service accounts that were created. But I do have the root password for my vCenter server instance. So that is something to be aware of. And I can go in and manage, just manage my environment. Okay. And so that's the management domain. Now, if I want to switch over to the virtual infrastructure workload domain, so here you can kind of see this is my second cluster. It looks a lot like the first cluster, but I just want to kind of show you where the first one was the convert the SDDC manager. This one is going to come as a VI workload domain. Now, one of the things about the VI workload domain is it can be older versions. So where the manager domain had to be on 8.0, it had to be on the VCF 5 release. This can be anything on the VCF 4, 5, and above. So here I actually have my vCenters running 7.0 update 3. Okay, and so now I can go ahead and go ahead and import this. So just coming here to my workload domains, and you'll see I just have my management domain. So if I go out here to my command line, same command we ran before with the check. This time I'm using the second vCenter server, and I changed the workload domain. It looks like I didn't change the workload domain, but I would call it workload domain 01. And then once I do it, here you'll see I changed the name to workload domain 01. So little error in my demo here, but now import with workload domain 01. And we'll go through and the same basic process that we've seen before, where I'll basically just pull it in, and you'll see here as it's coming in. And this takes about 10 minutes, and you'll see that the workload domain comes in, it goes into activating state. And, so it takes about 10 minutes to come in. And then once it's done, we now have the workload domain here. So we got 5 minutes left. I got one more demo to show you, and that is the sync. So I talked about how the sync feature allows you to basically manage configuration drift between the vSphere client and the SDDC manager. So as you do this, and as you start to bring these workloads in and create your private cloud, there will be situations where you'll make changes in vCenter, and then suddenly your SDDC manager is out of sync. And if that happens, what will happen is a lot of the SDDC manager workflows will become blocked. And in order to unblock them, you need to resync the configurations. So for this, if I come in here and we go into workload domains, you'll see here for workload domain 1, it currently is a cluster with 3 hosts. So I click on workload domain 1, I come in here, I look at my host. These errors are because I haven't licensed it. So with 5.2, we've gone to this license later mode. So I'm using trial licenses. That's why we see the errors there. But I got one cluster, and that one cluster has 3 hosts. So pretty straightforward. However, if we come up here to my vSphere client, you'll see that I've actually added 3 additional hosts. I added hosts 14, 15, and 16. So this does not match what the SDDC manager sees. So I need to do the sync. So to do this, so I come back here, 3 hosts. So to do this, I'm going to go out to that command line tool, and I'm just basically run that same command line tool with the sync option, passing that domain name in. And here, instead of passing the passwords on the command line, I entered them. And you'll see it will go through and it will basically update the inventory. And now I have 6 hosts. And so I was able to update workload domain. So basically it'll help me keep that configuration in sync. And so we're out of time. I want to thank everybody for their attention, for sticking with us as we've gone through this. I do have some resources here. I made these slides available in a PDF, so hopefully they'll get to you. You'll be able to kind of reference this. But there are a number of ways you can get some hands-on with VCF. We have the hands-on labs. We have VCF experience days. If you are interested in building your own lab, we do have something called the Holodeck Toolkit. This is something built by the tech marketing team. I was a big part of the effort to help build this. But it's basically a way you can run on a single ESXi host. You can basically deploy VCF in nested environments. We have some guidance on how to do that. So if you want more information on that, reach out to your TAM. We can definitely help hook you up. And then, of course, we got links to where you can get more information. And with that, we can go ahead and wrap up then.
Awesome. Hey, thanks, Kyle, for doing this. This is a really great presentation. Really incredibly useful content. I'll be sure to reference it in the future for sure. So, as we mentioned at the beginning, this session was recorded, and your TAM can make the recording link available to you. And also, please reach out to your TAM to address any questions we were unable to get to today. We hope you'll join us next month on November 14th, when we'll be exploring the new features in vSAN, and we definitely look forward to seeing you then. Thank you, and take care.
All right, thank you.